Welcome everyone to the Institute for Work and Health speaker series. I want to thank you all for joining us this morning. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to just encourage everyone to ask questions today of the speaker. Faraz will spend, I guess, of the first half of the hour with his presentation, and then we will open it up to your questions. And the way we'll do this is if you could please type your question into the chat box. I will then read the question to Faraz and he can give an answer. If we don't get to all the questions, Faraz will provide you with his email address and you can get in touch with him directly. But let me introduce Dr. Shahidi to you this morning. Dr. Faraz Vahid Shahidi is an associate scientist here at the Institute for Work and Health. He also holds an appointment as an assistant professor in the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. Dr. Shahidi is a social epidemiologist with interdisciplinary training in public health, social policy, and political economy, and his research examines the social and economic determinants of population health with a focus on the role that societal conditions play in shaping the health and safety of working people. Today, he's going to talk to us about the employment quality of persons with disabilities. So I will turn it over to you, Dr. Shahidi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shignac. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. It's really a pleasure to have this opportunity to present some ongoing work at the Institute, which I'm leading, looking, as Dr. Shignac mentioned, at the employment quality of persons with disabilities, using some sort of nationwide, recently collected data across the Canadian workforce. So jumping right in, I'd like to start by acknowledging the research team, which is led by Dr. Monique Shignac, our principal investigator, as well as Arif Jetta, Julie Bowring, Sabrina Tunima, and Salahuddin Ibrahim from the Institute for Work and Health, as well as Vicky Chrisman from Lakehead University and Jill Cameron at the University of Toronto. I'd also like to acknowledge the funding sources that have contributed to this sort of broader project and its team. Those are the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. So straight out of the gate, I want to give you a broad overview, a sense of the key sort of questions guiding the work that I'm about to present. And those key questions are as follows. How does the employment quality of persons with disabilities differ from that of persons without disabilities in Canada? And among persons with disabilities in Canada, is low employment quality a barrier to workplace communication and support for those persons with disabilities? And again, for those of you who might not be able to stay for the entire duration of the presentation, I want to sort of cover some key findings right out of the gate. So first, what we find is that there are large and persisting inequities in the employment quality of persons with versus without disabilities. And an important point I'm going to make today is that these inequities go well beyond our conventional indicators of sort of employment, like whether you're employed or unemployed, whether you're retired or otherwise economically inactive. These inequities really span comprehensively across sort of everything we know matters about employment and the conditions and terms of employment. We also find that persons with disabilities, just to quantify that gap, are nearly twice as likely to be in a precarious employment situation relative to persons without disabilities. We also find that among persons with disabilities, being in a precarious employment situation appears to act as a major barrier to sort of meaningful and effective communication and support in the workplace. The bigger sort of message and broader takeaway, I think, from the work that I'm going to present today, I actually want to sum up here as sort of inclusion does not guarantee equity. In fact, sort of what our findings here imply is that for many persons with disabilities, inclusion in the labor market can actually come at the cost to employment quality. And so really the key takeaway today, for those of you who are able to stay, is going to be that we need to sort of decouple this idea that's simply participating and closing the participation gap between persons with and without disabilities in the labor market really is not the same thing as sort of full, meaningful, equitable employment opportunities and employment conditions for persons with and without disabilities. So moving into a little bit of background, just a really broad overview of disability and employment in Canada. I think many of you today will already know all this information, but just for those who don't, in Canada, about 1 in 5 persons aged 15 and above report living with one or more disabilities, and that amounts to about 6.2 million Canadians. Among those 6.2 million Canadians, there are 2.2 million aged 25 to 64, roughly working age, who report being actively involved in paid employment. Another 650,000 working age Canadians with disabilities don't report being employed, but do report what Statistics Canada calls having the potential to work, which is just their way of saying these are persons who are either actively searching for paid employment opportunities or report having a desire, an interest in doing so very soon. In Canada and numerous other jurisdictions, of course, the right to an open and inclusive labor market for persons with disabilities is upheld, protected by various forms of sort of employment equity legislation and also a broader framework of international law. So just a couple of examples here, the Canadian Human Rights Act, more recently, the Accessible Canada Act, which was kind of a direct response in part to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, all of which sort of uphold this right to employment equity for persons with disabilities. The thing is, despite these numerous protections, persons with disabilities, we know, face persisting inequities in the labor market. And these inequities are in very large part due to the discrimination, stigma, stereotyping, and other sort of structural barriers that they face, not just in employment, but across various facets of life that might also intersect with employment. So just to give you a sense, an illustration of what we mean by these inequities, we can move to some of our conventional measures of sort of labor market inclusion. So here we have participation rates, employment rates by education level and disability severity in the 2012 Canadian Survey on Disability, clearly seeing a sort of gradient in participation rates between those who do not report living with a disability and those who report mild, moderate, or more severe disabilities. Another sort of conventional indicator is earnings, so employment income. And we know that all things being equal, there is a sort of discrimination gap in earnings between persons with and without disabilities when it comes to median earnings. Again, all other sort of characteristics, features, occupational factors, and so on being equal, there is this sort of discrimination gap. So again, just to give you a sense, using our conventional indicators of what we mean by these sort of persisting inequities in the employment participation and the employment income of persons with and without disabilities. Again, in Canada and many other jurisdictions, we're increasingly seeing and stressing labor market integration as a really promising strategy for improving and promoting the social and economic inclusion of persons with disabilities. And within this sort of universe of thinking around sort of labor market inclusion as a form of social and economic inclusion, within this universe of thinking, there's been a very strong emphasis on closing what we might call the employment participation gap. So sort of the gap in labor force participation between persons with and without disabilities. And so some key tools that we sort of stress within this emphasis on promoting participation are things like enhancing employability through training and so on, and reducing barriers to participation by, for example, building the awareness and confidence of employers with respect to sort of meaningful, equitable employment of persons with disabilities. And within this universe, much less emphasis has been placed on really understanding and improving sort of conditions once persons with disabilities do sort of attach themselves to the labor market and obtain paid employment. So we know a lot more about employment participation rates of persons with disabilities and we know a lot less about what happens once they participate. What sort of jobs and what quality of jobs are they obtaining once they do attach and integrate into the labor market? And we think this is a really important distinction because a priori, we kind of assume that simply participating does not guarantee meaningful, sustainable, and gainful opportunities for employment. There are so many other aspects to employment equity beyond simply having access to any given sort of opportunity for a paid job, right? So again, this need to distinguish and decouple mere inclusion and participation from a meaningful definition of sort of full and equitable employment opportunities for persons with disabilities. So before moving into the study, the data, and so on, just to narrow in for a minute on this concept of employment quality to help frame what's coming next. We have a few assumptions here to lay out that guide the research question and the work that we conducted based on those questions. The first of these assumptions is that, quite frankly, not all jobs are created equal. And in fact, in Canada, there are prevailing concerns that the overall quality of jobs is in decline. So this idea that jobs are becoming less stable and secure and more precarious and insecure. We also know from a broader sort of set of public health literature that having a bad job can be as harmful to your physical and mental health as having no job at all. So we have this notion that, any job is better than having no job at all. And as it turns out, at least when it comes to the physical, mental, and social well-being of persons, some jobs are actually worse for us than having no job. We also know from a broader literature comprised of various qualitative and smaller quantitative studies that persons with disabilities report job insecurity and other indicators of low or precarious job quality as a barrier to disability disclosure, reasonable accommodations, safety in terms of communicating personal and other needs in the workplace, and so on. And so we have this clue, this hint that this is probably an area of research that we should narrow in on and better understand. And sort of bringing all these assumptions together, the major premise here is, again, just that employment equity, we think, is really only meaningful if it exists across the entire employment cycle, from training and recruitment all the way to retention, promotion, and retirement, right? A meaningful definition of equity can't be reduced or collapsed to mere participation and inclusion. It needs to be fuller, more comprehensive. What happens when people do enter into employment over the course of their employment cycle, their employment sort of life cycle. So again, just to drive the point home, the problem, right? That we sometimes sort of emphasize to the exclusion of employment quality, this notion of participation. And we sort of haven't paid as much attention to what happens once people are included, once people do integrate, once people do participate and obtain paid employment in the Canadian labor market. And the idea here is that we can close a participation gap, but leave behind a very large employment quality gap. So we do need to be attending to both of these sort of aspects of employment equity. Another key component of the research problem is that our flagship survey in Canada for measuring and monitoring the employment situation of Canadian workers, that's the Labor Force Survey, does not collect information on disability status. And as a result, we lack what we think would be sort of a comprehensive statistical portrait of employment quality among persons with disabilities. So this sort of gap in our measurement of the employment situation of Canadian workers, this failure to collect information on disability status, what it does is place out of our view a whole suite of possible inequities impacting the working lives of persons with disabilities, because we simply can't measure these inequities using our flagship survey that ought to really enable us to do so. And this is really where our study comes in. So our study objectives were twofold. First, we wanted to evaluate and compare the employment quality of persons with and without disabilities in Canada. In other words, we wanted to do what we unfortunately can't do with the flagship labor force survey. And second, we wanted to examine whether among persons with disabilities, there's a relationship between an individual's quality of employment and their experiences when it comes to workplace communication, accommodation, and support. In order to do that, we administered, an online cross-sectional survey in June 2020. So this is right about when most provinces in Canada are starting to loosen some of the first set of public health measures they put in place in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In order to be eligible for that survey, that online cross-sectional survey, individuals had to be 18 years of age or more. They had to be currently employed at least 12 hours per week, and they had to be comfortable completing our questionnaire in either English or French. We recruited individuals from an existing panel of about 100,000 Canadians and used sort of what we call purposive sampling to ensure that we had the sort of statistical power to measure the inequities we were interested in measuring between persons with and without disabilities. And this meant making sure that we, what we call, oversampled for persons with disabilities. And we were able to achieve a response rate of about 26.5%, which on the spectrum of response rates for these sorts of online cross-sectional surveys recruited from existing panels, I think is actually really good. So we were quite pleased. So what did we measure? We of course measure disability status, and for that we used a shortened version of the disability screener question that's used by Statistics Canada. So we asked a series of 3 questions about whether persons had physical, mental, or other health problems or conditions expected to last at least 6 months that can make working difficult at least some of the time. And using these 3 questions, we created 5 groups. Those who reported not living or working with a disability, those who reported working with one or more disability. And among that latter group, further distinguished between those who reported physical disabilities, mental disabilities, and both a physical and mental disability. We adopted a very multi-dimensional view of employment quality. And again, the goal here was to move beyond very simple and crude, important, but simple and crude conventional indicators of employment towards a really comprehensive and as holistic as possible view of sort of an individual's employment situation, the quality of their employment. So we asked things around job insecurity, income insecurity, unpaid wages, nature of hours with respect to sort of, are they long, are they irregular, are they unpredictable, do they lack flexibility? Are you on a temporary versus permanent contract? Do you identify your job as being part of this emerging gig economy? Do you feel trapped in your job, unable to move to a better one, unable to sort of seek other new novel opportunities for yourself? Is there a mismatch between your skills and training and the job that you have? Does your job provide training opportunities? Does it provide the sort of environment conducive to you raising important health and safety concerns? Are you represented by a union? And do you have access to benefits like pensions? We also asked a series of questions related to workplace communications and the availability of workplace accommodations and supports. So I think there's some value in going through these questions, so I'll just read them out. Have you talked to any of the following persons about any limitations you have that might affect your work that are related to your health or disability? If you were to experience difficulties in your ability to work because of personal needs, how willing would you be to share your personal situation with these individuals? To what extent are you free to ask for the following accommodations without fear of retaliation or punishment? And which of the following workplace accommodations do you need to use but not have available to you? We also adjusted for the following socio-demographic characteristics. So all of the results I'm going to present to you are adjusted for these variables: age, gender, education, and immigration status. Right before moving into results, just to give you a broad overview of our sample, and specifically using the bold red text here, just to sort of narrow in on a few, what to me seemed like some really important aspects of who we ended up recruiting. Starting with age, we found that we had a really nice distribution overall between age categories, and part of that was, again, some purposive sampling to ensure diversity with respect to age. But one thing to sort of note, potentially not a surprise to those working in this area or with experience in this area, but persons who reported physical disabilities were much more likely to also fall in the sort of higher age categories, while persons reporting mental disabilities were sort of disproportionately likely to fall in the younger age categories. So we noticed that. With respect to gender, in the overall sample, a really good, nice distribution. And we did notice, again, following prior sort of studies like ours, that men were more likely to report not living with a disability, while women were more likely than men to report living with one or more disabilities. Immigration status, again, evidence of what we generally see and what we call the the healthy immigrant effect among persons with disabilities. The proportion who reported being born outside of Canada was much lower than the sort of counterpart proportion in the part of the sample that did not report a disability. And finally, with respect to education, something really important to bring your attention to is just that we ended up recruiting a highly educated sample relative to the rest of the sort of general, the general working population in Canada. And we see this sort of over and over again with these panels, with these samples recruited from panels. So just to give you a specific sense, the proportion who reported having a post-secondary degree was about 78% among those without a disability, and about 70% with those among those with a disability. And that compares to about a rate of about 50% in the labor force in the general working population. So again, we ended up not intentionally, but we did end up selecting for persons who were more highly educated than the source population we were trying to draw from. So moving into our first set of results, persons with disabilities reported consistently worse employment conditions than persons without disabilities. And again, the point here is that these inequities, these worse employment conditions, go well beyond the sort of conventional indicators we measure, like participation, employment participation, employment rates. So they were more likely to report job insecurity and income insecurity, more likely to report feeling trapped or locked in their job, more likely to report a sort of mismatch between what they're trained to do and what they do in their job, more likely to report unpaid wages by their employer. And what we found really interesting too was just less likely to report flexible hours. And this was interesting because in some places in the literature, you hear talk of sort of gig work and so on as actually being an asset to persons with disabilities because of the flexibility it affords them. So we thought it was very important and interesting to notice that actually persons with disabilities were reporting higher rates of lack in flexibility in their hours. So this was a pretty consistent pattern across almost all of our 16 indicators of employment quality, but just giving you a broad sense here using 6 of our indicators. Persons with both physical and mental disabilities often reported the worst employment conditions of all groups. So again, just trying to add some nuance here to the sort of a blunter story on the previous slide. We know there is an employment quality gap. We know there are inequities in employment conditions between persons with and without disabilities. And what the slide is just encouraging us to do is to understand the nuances of sort of what happens when we collapse everybody into these sort of crude categories like no disability and any disability, but actually the sort of value and importance of knowing that there are sort of unique experiences that emerge depending on the type of employment experience, the type of disability that you are experiencing as a person. In general, however, one big takeaway is that across most of these employment indicators, persons with both physical and mental disabilities reported greater adversity with respect to employment quality. And then along a small, but we think notable subset of dimensions, persons with disabilities reported comparable or even better employment conditions. So to highlight the sort of key ones here, persons with disabilities were not more likely, contrary to the other sort of adversities, not more likely to report long hours, unpredictable hours, or a lack of representation by a union. And we think what's happening here intuitively is a selection of persons with disabilities into the types of jobs that might protect them and empower them. So, you know, I don't want long hours. I don't want unpredictability. These things are harmful to me. So I'm going to opt, I'm going to the best of my ability, at least, ensure that I have an employment situation that doesn't cause me to sort of experience long hours at work, unpredictable hours at work, and that does ensure that I have representation and protection by a union. So we think that that might be going on here. Using our data, we also identified 4 overarching types of employment, or sometimes we call them sort of like flavors of employment in the Canadian labor market. And the way this works is that we sort of put the data into an algorithm that digests that data and identifies patterns in the data. And what these patterns represent are groups of workers who share in common a set of employment characteristics, those employment conditions that we measured along 16 dimensions. And so what the algorithm in this case digested and outputted for us were 4 overarching types of employment. We had those in standard employment, or what we call standard employment. So workers in this group reported favorable employment conditions across virtually every dimension of employment quality, and we might sort of add the tag secure and rewarding work. Portfolio employment was comprised of those workers who reported generally positive employment conditions, but a distinguishing quality here was that their hours were very long and a lot less predictable than standard employment. So we might add the tag secure but demanding jobs. We also identified a third group in instrumental employment situations. These situations are instrumental in the sense that they afford persons with the sort of stability and security part of employment, but they offered a lot less in terms of the sort of rewards and benefits of work beyond simply sort of like, I want a secure job that gives me a secure income. These were jobs that, for example, reported high levels of sort of the job lock and job mismatch. So the tag secure, but I feel trapped in this job. And finally, we have the category of precarious employment, in which workers reported overwhelmingly negative employment conditions across most dimensions, and we add the tag insecure and unrewarding. So persons with disabilities were nearly twice as likely to be in a precarious or instrumental employment situation. So to put it a little differently, using our tags, persons with disabilities were nearly twice as likely to be in a situation that we would characterize as either secure but trapped, or insecure and unrewarding. Just leave that there for 1 minute, less than a minute. Again, when we try to add some nuance here, what we found, again, was that the employment quality gap was largest for persons with both a physical and mental disability. So persons with physical and mental disabilities were more than twice as likely to report being in an employment situation that we would characterize as sort of secure but trapped, or insecure and unrewarding. So again, rates of standard and portfolio employment much lower in general among persons with disabilities, and even lower among the subset among them who report both physical and mental disabilities, while proportions reporting instrumental or precarious employment, trapped and insecure forms of employment being considerably higher, again with a gradient. Among persons with disabilities, we asked whether precarious employment is associated with sort of workplace disclosure, communication, support, and accommodations. And what we found is that persons with disabilities who are in a precarious employment situation are less likely to disclose information about work limitations. So we asked again, just to refresh, have you talked to the following actors about any limitations you have that might affect your work that are related to your health or disability? So precariously employed persons with disabilities compared to standardly employed persons with disabilities were less likely to have disclosed that limitation to their supervisor or manager, and less likely to have disclosed that limitation to most or all of their coworkers. And again, this is less around prescriptively or normatively saying you should or shouldn't, and more around saying there's a gap here between two sort of social groups in the labor market that we need to attend to and we need to explain. So there is a gap there that needs some thought and explanation. As well, persons with disabilities in a precarious employment situation were less willing to communicate about personal needs. So if you were to experience difficulties in your ability to work because of, say, personal needs, how willing would you be to share that personal situation with your supervisor or manager, your coworkers, or others in the workplace, like your union rep or your HR rep? And here we're representing the proportion who responded, I would be quite a bit or a great deal willing. And you see some larger gaps here between persons with disabilities who were in precarious employment situations versus in standard employment. So much less likely to feel willing to share a personal situation affecting their ability to work. Just a couple more results slides. Persons with disabilities in a precarious employment situation were less likely to feel safe asking for accommodations. So to what extent do you feel free to ask for family-related accommodations or health-related accommodations without fear of retaliation or punishment? This is showing you the proportion who responded to a large extent or to a very large extent, I feel free, and sort of rates being twice as high among persons with disabilities in standard employment than those in precarious employment. So a really sizable gap here with respect to how safe precariously employed persons with disabilities feel pursuing accommodation needs. And finally, persons with disabilities in a precarious employment situation were more likely to report unmet accommodation needs. Not so surprising given what I've just presented, but sort of thinking about all these results as sort of fitting together. Which of the following workplace accommodations do you need to use but not have available to you? So, for example, the proportion of persons with disabilities who reported needing modified job duties but not having that available to them was 16% among those in standard employment and 37.3% among those in precarious employment. And a similar pattern across accommodation needs, so modified workstation, including sort of adaptive devices, technology, and so on, and work from home. So just 5 more minutes to sort of bring all this together and share some key messages for you before hopefully addressing some questions from you. So a summary of the findings: persons with disabilities reported consistently worse employment conditions than their counterparts without disabilities. And again, I'll just say it one more time, this spanned well beyond the conventional indicators we generally use to measure employment equity, like labor force participation. This pattern of inequity spans virtually every sort of aspect of employment beyond even those conventional measures. So again, just cluing into this idea that we need to adopt a broader, more capacious understanding of equity and how we measure it for persons with disabilities in the labor market. Just to quantify that sort of gap, persons with disabilities, again, were nearly twice as likely to be in a precarious or instrumental employment situation. And this gap in employment quality is largest, based on our data, for persons with both physical and mental disabilities. It also appears to be the case, and I think the evidence is quite strong here, but we'll get into some limitations, that precarious employment is operating, we think, as a major barrier to the ability of persons with disabilities to sort of communicate in the workplace, communicate their needs, their accommodation needs, and so on in the workplace, and have access to the supports they need. So we do think that precarious employment is acting as a major barrier to communication and support in the workplace. And this, of course, has implications for, again, that capacious, that broader definition and understanding of employment equity and meaningful full inclusion for persons with disabilities. And these findings are consistent with the notion that persons with disabilities experience inequities across the entire employment cycle, not just with respect to participation in the labor market, which is how we generally measure that gap, but also with respect to the terms and conditions of their participation. Before getting into some key sort of takeaways and broader messages here, just quickly the limitations. So we use cross-sectional data collected at a single point in time. So for example, we think there's likely bidirectionality here between a job that supports your accommodation needs and a job you describe to us as being sort of precarious. So we think there's some bidirectionality here that we can't really get at using our data. The sample was broadly representative, but as I noted, there's strong indication of selection for more higher educated workers. And so how this would generalize to the sort of source population, the working age population, we're not entirely sure, but worth mentioning here, this limitation. Also, the unemployment rate in June 2020 was 12.3%, and provinces had only just begun to relax public health measures in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in a sentence, a way to think about this limitation is we could only tell you about the employment quality gap among those persons with disabilities who retained employment while the unemployment rate was 12.3%. So there's a lot of people that we lose out from this sample because, for example, it's possible, and I think likely, that persons with disabilities were disproportionately impacted by that jobs shock, resulting in a 12% employment rate. And we could not, in most cases, consider how disability status interacts with other identities because we lack the statistical power to do so. Last slide, so thank you for your patience. But just, I think, beyond this sort of empirical statistical findings, we think there are some really important key messages here that I'll just go over for you. So a reminder, right, that inclusion does not guarantee equity. In fact, inclusion in the labor market, it seems, can come at a cost to the employment quality of persons with disabilities. So we need to not collapse these two categories together. We can close an inclusion gap without closing an equity gap here. And part of this point is that labor force participation shouldn't be treated as a silver bullet or panacea. The terms and conditions of participation matter. And the goal shouldn't just to create whatever jobs are possible, but the goal when it comes to sort of meaningful equity is to create opportunities for sustainable, gainful employment opportunities. I also want to stress again that there is a major gap in our surveillance because our flagship survey does not enable us to conduct a routine and systematic assessment of employment quality among persons with disabilities because we're not asking questions and we're not collecting information about disability status in our flagship labor force survey. And finally, when it comes to sort of building back better jobs in particular, subsequently sort of in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, we do want to stress that this has to mean that we attend comprehensively to the full range of labor market experiences of persons with disabilities. Again, not just with respect to a gap in participation and sort of crude measures of inclusion, but sort of more meaningful, comprehensive measures of equity in the labor market. And that is it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shahidi. That was really interesting, and the fact that you had so many more measures that you were able to include in the research really brings a lot of depth and insight, I think, for us here today. I do want to just encourage people who are listening to put your questions in the chat box, and I will ask them. We do have several questions for you, for us, as well as people thanking you for your very enlightening presentation, a great talk. I do want to also mention before I ask you the first question that a recording will be available and the slides will be available to all participants in about a week's time. So let me just open up with our first question, which is someone is asking about more than one job. Many people with a disability may be working at 2 different jobs. Do you have, or if you had, in this case, were there participants who had more than one job, and did they have different levels of security and reward? So somebody might have had a part-time office job and a food delivery gig job, for example. Were you able to sort of think about some of that in terms of putting people into different levels of security and reward for their work?
Right. So as the person sort of noted, absolutely, persons in the sample working more than one job. So first on the measurement side of things, so how we approach the survey. So we asked people to describe, if they were holding more than one job, to describe the characteristics of their main job. So we allowed individuals, respondents, to identify for themselves what their main job was. And I appreciate that could be difficult in some situations, but based on identifying their main job, to answer subsequent questions about employment quality. But the question is also cluing me into the fact that in our analyses, we actually didn't incorporate and consider that variable telling us about people working more than one job. So right now, I actually can't tell you much about that, other than we asked people to describe their main job. What I would like to do subsequent to this presentation is to go back and see whether we might even consider incorporating a variable around multiple job holding as one of our employment quality indicators. So I really appreciate that question, and I think that is the takeaway for me, that I think we should go back to the data and look a little closer at that variable and see if we might not incorporate that, partly to see inequities in job holding or multiple job holding between these groups. Thank you for that.
Okay, next question. Do you have some thoughts, and can you comment on the universality or the generalizability of your conclusions across international boundaries, knowing that Canada has a particular political and social context that may be similar or different to other countries?
Right. I think what we know from the literature is the nature of the issues we're describing here, both with respect to participation and access to the labor market, but also with respect to what happens with respect to stability and security once people are integrated into the labor market. The differences we see across, let's say, roughly comparable jurisdictions in North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, sort of the OECD countries, these are differences in degree rather than in sort of direction. So the issues we think exist in all of these sort of comparable peer jurisdictions, but it is true that in some societies, we are doing a much better job of reducing the magnitude, sort of addressing these inequities than in other societies. And I couldn't tell you right now where Canada lies on that sort of spectrum, but there is a going notion, again, in the scientific literature, that societies in Europe that provide much more institutionally, policy-wise, with respect to job insecurity, are doing a little bit of a better job of addressing this insecurity gap, this security gap, than other societies. So, but hopefully that answers your question.
Mm-hmm. So again, great presentation, someone writes, and I was wondering if, even though you had an enhanced group of measures to look at job quality and employment, are there other measures now that you've been looking at this area more that you wish had been included in this survey, or that could be measured in subsequent research, including population studies?
Yeah, I think the main takeaway for me, because we designed this survey, I actually don't know off the top of my head if I feel that we've missed anything. I'm sure we have, but off the top of my head, there's no pressing question or two that in retrospect, I wish we had included. The big takeaway for me is, how do we identify some subset, if it's not possible to identify all of these indicators, and bring them into our routine surveillance data, right, where I think they should be. So a lot of the questions we asked around subjective job insecurity, job lock, job mismatch, These are not collected in the labor force survey either. And what that means is we have both a gap in measurement in the labor force survey, that flagship employment survey, both with respect to disability status and with respect to some of these dimensions of employment that we had a really unique opportunity as people who, as a team that was designing the survey, to incorporate, but that don't exist, again, in that flagship survey like the labor force survey. So I'm sure there are, if we were to redo it, 1 or 2 questions we would bring in. But for me, the big takeaway is we know these indicators matter and we know there are inequities along these dimensions, and we're not really measuring it outside of the context of these sort of convenient surveys that teams like ours and others are developing for small samples.
Okay, there are a couple of questions about measurement in the sample for just some clarification. So someone is asking whether or not you were able to, or asked about differentiating between a disability that are derived from work, like an occupational injury, from other sources that, health conditions that may have created a disability. And also someone who's asking whether individuals with intellectual or cognitive disabilities would be included in the sample. And sort of more about how you define physical and mental disabilities. And I can repeat that for you, for us, if you forget. But maybe first of all, were you able to differentiate the source of a disability?
So my recollection is no, we were not. So the question asked, does this sort of affect your work? But our question, our shortened version of the screener question for disability status, did not ask whether the source of that disability was related to work or occupation. So I think that answers the first question. This was, we know, a health or limiting condition affecting work, but not necessarily sourced or caused at work on the job. And persons with intellectual and cognitive disabilities would be included, both in the broad living with 1 or more disabilities category and those who report having a mental or cognitive disability. Was there a part 2 to that question?
I think they were interested more in how physical and mental disability was defined as well in general.
Right. So we prompted those screener questions with examples. So in the case of physical, we talked about sort of seeing, problems seeing, hearing, walking, and so on. For mental and cognitive, we also prompted with examples like concentrating, learning, anxiety, depression, substance use, and so on. So what we did do was provide some prompts, non-exclusive in the sense of not limited to what we are prompting here, but to help answer these questions, some examples as prompts. But ultimately, the decision lay with the person responding the survey, whether they would check off physical, mental, or describe some other disability, which we would then manually code as either physical or mental or both.
Okay, thank you. Is there a reference for the 4 types of employment quality groups that you presented, the standard portfolio? Is there a reference to that, to those groups?
Yeah, so if the question is a reference to the results of our data analysis, not yet, but I'm sure we will, as soon as possible, be circulating news of publications from our work. If the question is about have others, and of course they have, but have others worked on this concept of creating a typology or flavors of employment, of which some would be standard, some would be sort of secure but demanding, some would be secure but trapped, and some would be just frankly insecure and unrewarding? The answer is yes, and I would be happy to provide those sources, but they include scholars like Trevor Peckham just south of us, and scholars like Christophe Van Rollen over across the pond in Europe, but that's probably not helpful. What would maybe be helpful if you're interested in seeing some of that work on creating typologies of employment quality to capture things like precarious employment as a multidimensional concept and construct, you could certainly email me. And the email is right there on the screen, and I would be very happy to share our colleagues' work from Europe and the US, where they've definitely conducted similar analyses to produce these sorts of typologies as well.
Okay, and I'm hoping I get this next question correct. So apologies to the person who asked if I'm not getting it quite correctly here. The individual's very interested in the communication disclosure issues, and noting that in this survey you asked people whether or not they had disclosed, and they, you know, it's really whether they feel comfortable disclosing that was assessed here. But there's also sometimes a movement to have a standardized indicator where employees tick off. You mentioned measuring disability, and employees might be asked to tick off whether or not they are part of a group or identify with that group. And do you have comments about the sort of legal ramifications of this? And do you know if there are efforts to try to include more questions like this in data collection and kind of get at some of the richness around communication?
Yeah, so honestly, my answer is I don't know. I'm not really in a position, particularly with respect to legal ramifications, to really comment on that. Just especially from the perspective of expertise, I'm not sure I'm the right person to do that. I am a person, again, you could reach out to, and I would be happy to try to connect you with others who I think could answer that question, including some colleagues at the Institute. So not something I feel I'm in a position to comment on today here, but definitely something that I would be happy to do some connecting work if that's possible. If you were to email me with that question, I think there are people at the Institute with the right expertise in the right position to answer this question.
Okay, a couple of questions about other surveys, population health surveys. Do you know if any provinces or territories have been conducting surveys on employment and disability? And do you feel that if we had a separate survey that really focused on disability, that, you know, this might close the gap in you know, labor force surveys that we see? We might be able to get the information we need to act on it.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts in that respect. So there are other, not even provincial, but nationwide surveys that Statistics Canada routinely or semi-routinely collect. So routinely, it's something like the Canadian Income Survey that does include a disability screener set of questions and does include some measures, of course, because it's an income survey, around a person's employment situation. That survey does not provide the sort of comprehensive portrait that we think it is time to be able to provide for society in order to paint a fuller view of what is happening among persons who do integrate and attach to a job, to paid employment. Semi-routinely, we collect so far 2 waves, I believe, annually in 20, or not, as in the years, 2012 and 2017, the Canadian Survey on Disability. Also contains a couple of really, more than a couple, but about a handful of questions around employment and labor force participation. But again, not nearly the comprehensive and full view we think we need. And people with disabilities frankly deserve in order sort of for us to be able to monitor and evaluate progress towards equity and closing these employment gaps. And the broader reflection I would share is these surveys tend to be smaller projects, less resource projects over at Statistics Canada, because not everything can be your flagship labor force survey, right? Even in terms of the size of samples being collected and so on in the LFS and the labor force survey are really phenomenally, like they're fantastic. So my reflection is it would be great if things like the Canadian Income Survey and the Canadian Survey on Disability collected more information on employment and dimensions of employment and experiences in paid employment and so on. But ultimately, I would press on the need for our flagship survey meant to monitor employment situation of Canadian workers to incorporate both, you know, better. They're absent right now. So to incorporate disability related questions and to incorporate better questions related to employment and employment quality.
Okay, and we've got a lot of questions. We may not be able to get to all of them in the next few minutes, but I do want to encourage people to reach out for us individually if we don't get to your question. But several people are asking about whether or not you have data or the potential to look at things like specific industries or occupations and see whether or not there are differences in quality. For example, is there a public-private sector difference that you might be able to explore?
Another fantastic question. So the answer is yes, we did, of course, collect information on things like occupation and industry. And no, we haven't looked at that in this work, but I think everyone will agree with you that doing so could reveal some interesting insights. So this is another note I'm going to leave for myself to do, and I appreciate that feedback.
And similarly, although not entirely the same, issues are being the opportunity to explore issues related to race or urban, rural. Do you have data that might help illuminate some of this? Or you mentioned, I think at one point, your numbers are small in some areas and you don't have the power to look at some of this. Can you just comment on that?
Yeah, so we collected information on a number of sociodemographic characteristics. And I mentioned, for example, that we even statistically adjusted rather than sort of stratified, but statistically adjusted for some of these factors like age and gender and immigration status. The trouble is that especially for some of the nuances that we were looking for with respect to if you think about, there are 16 indicators and also 4 employment types and also 5 disability related groups and so on. Once you start putting these sort of key study measures into a table to further sort of intersect those categories with other categories, in general would result in sample sizes that were just too small, not sufficiently powered statistically in order for us to say with a considerable degree of confidence, statistical confidence, what is happening in the labor market. Which for me, again, the key takeaway is it would be lovely if teams like ours were funded to collect larger samples, but fundamentally, we have those really large samples being collected in the labor force survey. And recently, with the addition of new variables like race and so on, there are growing opportunities or missed opportunities given the absence of information on disability status and so on. So that answers your question.
Okay, and maybe, unfortunately, again, I only have time for one more question, and then I think, again, people can reach out to you. Someone is asking, I don't think you did it in your study, distinguished between people born with a disability versus disabilities acquired later in life. Do you think that that might be an important distinction to look at employment? So can you talk about some comments on that?
Yeah, so I can't comment directly on it in the sense that it's not something we collected information about and certainly not something I analyzed in the data I presented today, but I want to echo sort of what I think is likely the spirit of the question, which is it probably does matter because we know that sort of where in a person's life course and cycle as an employee, as a worker, they experience a disability or a limitation of some sort matters for the trajectory that life course and that employee life cycle takes. With respect, for example, training opportunities and educational opportunities early on in life, right? So I'll just echo the spirit of the question, which is it probably does matter, but not something that we looked at. And I would again probably worry about some sample size issues if we were, but I'll echo, yeah, again, the spirit of the question. I totally agree that it's important.
Okay, unfortunately, that's all the time we're going to have today for questions, but I want to really thank you, Dr. Shahidi, for your great presentation and for everyone who attended and the really excellent questions. In terms of moving forward, yes, there will be a publication that we anticipate about this, as well as a number of other outreach activities. Would encourage all of you who have joined us today to sign up for IWH News and other IWH updates, like our speaker series. We will have our next open speaker series on June 14th, and this will be given by Dr. Abhi Biswas, who will be talking about is there an optimal daily movement pattern for heart health, a study of Canadian workers' activity tracker data. So thank you everyone for attending, and again, thank you so much for a really great presentation. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.